Did you know that foreign investors are quietly funding lawsuits in American courts through a practice called third-party litigation funding? Shadowy overseas funders are paying to sue American companies in our courts, and they don't pay a dime in U.S. taxes if there is an award or settlement. They profit tax-free from our legal system, while U.S. companies are tied up in court, and American families pay the price, to the tune of $5,000 a year. But there is a solution. A new proposal before Congress would close this loophole and ensure these foreign investors pay taxes, just like the actual plaintiffs have to. It's a common-sense move that discourages frivolous and abusive lawsuits and redirects resources back into American jobs, innovation, and growth. Only President Trump and congressional Republicans can deliver this win for America and hold these foreign investors accountable. Contact your lawmakers today and demand they take a stand to end foreign-funded litigation abuse.
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows home so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews all on the app. Download today.
Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I want to talk today about kind of questions around identity and war. The version that we get from war movies when you see, U.S. Marines in the Pacific or British soldiers at Dunkirk or, the air crews flying over Europe. Is that you're looking at some kind of cultural, monosocial experience, and obviously in a country like America, this huge melting pot of mass immigration, somewhere like Great Britain, which was had been gone through a sort of a century of social transformation, in part due to its empire. And you find that obviously the British rely on a global empire to fight its wars. Then you're not looking at this sort of monocultural block. There are in the British Army, in the British population, in America, in other allied nations, there are these kind of intersections of ethnicity. What did Irish Americans make of, the hated Mr. Churchill's war? What did German Americans make of it? How did Polish Americans feel about, the President of America cozying up to the other hated enemy, Joseph Stalin? What were the loyalties of Indian soldiers, of Caribbean soldiers and airmen? These are really, really interesting questions of kind of identity, diaspora, of personal politics and morality, and there are pragmatisms at play here. There are people that didn't like the British Empire but thought it was going to be an awful lot better than Nazism. There were people who had been come under the heel of the British Empire and thought, well, we'll take our chances. Anwar Sadat, the later president of Egypt, assassinated in his later years, was a spy in Cairo for the Germans. Why? Was he a Nazi? No, no, not in the slightest. He's an Arab nationalist. But he hated the British with good reason. The British had been in Egypt since 1882 and were loathed. Their soldiers were kind of uncouth and rowdy on the streets and frequently kind of abusive and racist to Egyptians. And the question of the canal and for the Egyptians with longer memories, the kind of quasi-bankrupting of Egypt through a kind of a mixture of kind of collapsing cotton prices and indebtedness to British banks had left a very sour taste. But the point is that there were kind of all sorts of different national histories and personal histories and cultural histories at play at any one time during this kind of tumultuous struggle against fascism. But because we know it was a struggle against fascism, we tend to make these very simple absolutes of, these binaries of Axis and Allies. And there are all sorts of different shades and gradations of loyalties in between. So once again, we're looking at Max Hastings. All hell let loose. Sorry. And chapter 16, Divided Empires. He writes, Winston Churchill stretched an important point by telling the House of Commons on the 8th of December 1941, we have at least 4/5 of the population of the globe on our side. It would have been more accurate to assert that the Allies had 4/5 of the world's inhabitants under their control, or recoiling from Axis occupation. Propaganda promoted an assumption of common purpose in the free nations, amongst which it was necessary to grant nominal inclusion to Stalin's people, in defeating the totalitarian powers. Yet in almost every country there were nuances of attitude, and some places stark divergences of loyalty. South America was the continent least affected by the struggle. Though Brazil joined the Allied cause in August 1942 and sent 25,000 of its soldiers to participate, there were Brazilian soldiers at the Battle of Monte Cassino, for example. Almost invisibly in the Italian campaign. Most of the nations that escaped involvement were protected by geographical remoteness. Turkey was the most significant state to sustain neutrality, having learned its lesson from rash involvement in World War I on the side of the Central Powers. In Europe, only Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Sweden and Switzerland were fortunate enough to have their sovereignty respected by the belligerents, most for pragmatic reasons. Ireland had gained self-control, governing Dominion status in 1922, although until 1938 Britain retained control of 4 strategically important treaty ports on the coastline. In 1939-40, as the former mother nation began to struggle for survival against the U-boat, Winston Churchill was tempted by the notion of reasserting by force his country's claims upon those naval and air bases. He was dissuaded only by fear of the impact on opinion in the United States, where there was a strong Irish lobby. There is a lot said about Irish neutrality during the Second World War, and kind of veiled criticism of Ireland, and a hint that De Valera was somehow in cahoots with Hitler. And this is really not true and really, really not fair. The numerous examples of German airmen shot down over Ireland, having been interred for the war, and Allied airmen being allowed back over the border into Northern Ireland. The intelligence from Irish Coast Guards and watchers passed on to the British about German ship and U-boat manoeuvres, and other key assistance. And obviously 50,000 Irishmen joined the British Army. In part because Ireland is extremely poor and there is good pay and conditions in the British Army, But also, there were men who believed that the fight against fascism, just as it had been fought in Spain, it now needed to be fought under the leadership of the British Army, which for people with even short memories in Ireland dating back to the 1920s, that's kind of a big and bitter pill to swallow. Obviously, I mean, many Irish veterans returning were actually treated abominably by De Valera, because they were men who were viewed as called deserters, who had gone to fight for a foreign power. So there is the kind of during the wartime, during the war, the Irish Republic gave assistance to the British, but afterwards treated its own veterans absolutely dreadfully. There's a whole other very dark history to be that has been indeed written about that. The Atlantic air gap was significantly widened as a result of not having the treaty ports, and many lives and tonnage lost in consequence of the fanatical loathing of Irish Prime Minister Eamon de Valera for his British neighbours. The crews of almost every warship and merchantman that sailed past the Irish coastline in the war years felt a surge of bitterness towards the country, again not entirely deserved, which relied on Britain for its most vital commodities and all its fuel, but would not lift a finger to help in its hour of need, again not entirely true. The cost in men and ships ran up a score which Irish eyes are smiling on the day of the Allied victory were not going to cancel, wrote a corvette officer, Nicolas Montserrat. In the list of people you were prepared to like when the war was over, the man who stood by and watched while you were getting your throat cut could not figure very highly. Yet because of Ireland's divided sovereignty and loyalties, even Northern Ireland, still a part of the United Kingdom, never dared to introduce conscription for military service. The perverse outcome was that more Catholic Southern Irishmen than Protestant Northerners, who loudly asserted their commitment to the Crown, served in Britain's wartime armed forces, though the services of most Southerners were purchased by economic necessity rather than seduced by ideological enthusiasm for the Allied cause. Again, that's unfair. There were numerous people that saw war, saw fighting. And these are people from impoverished parts of the world, parts of India and Africa, who saw service in the British Army as prestigious. They saw it as something that would pay well. They saw it as a role with respect. And it was something that brought pride in the community. There are numerous examples across India of people being motivated to fight for both monetary reasons and also personal reasons of pride and self-worth, which seems like a funny thing to prioritize when you're being shot at, but people do think like this. So I think the idea that Irish men in the Republic were just kind of bribed to join the British Army, I don't think that sort of encapsulates the full experience of them. So sorry, Max Hastings, I'm not going to give you that.
Instacart is on a mission to have you not leave the couch this basketball season. Because between the pregame rituals and the postgame interviews, it can be difficult to find time for everything else. So let Instacart take care of your game day snacks or weekly restocks and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes. Because we hear it's bad luck to be hungry on game day. So download the Instacart app today and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Service fees apply for 3 orders in 14 days, excludes restaurants.
Did you know that foreign investors are quietly funding lawsuits in American courts through a practice called third-party litigation funding? Shadowy overseas funders are paying to sue American companies in our courts, and they don't pay a dime in U.S. taxes if there is an award or settlement. They profit tax-free from our legal system, while U.S. companies are tied up in court and American families pay the price, to the tune of $5,000 a year. But there is a solution. A new proposal before Congress would close this loophole and ensure these foreign investors pay taxes, just like the actual plaintiffs have to. It's a common sense move that discourages frivolous and abusive lawsuits and redirects resources back into American jobs, innovation, and growth. Only President Trump and congressional Republicans can deliver this win for America and hold these foreign investors accountable. Contact your lawmakers today and demand they take a stand to end foreign-funded litigation abuse.
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows homes so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews all on the app. Download today.
That one. The Swedes asserted their status with a rigour promoted by proximity to Germany and thus vulnerability to its ill will. They arrested and imprisoned scores of Allied intelligence agents and informants. Only in 1944-45, when the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, did the Stockholm government become more responsive to diplomatic pressure from London and Washington, and less zealous in locking up Allied sympathisers. Switzerland was a hub of Allied intelligence operations, though the Swiss authorities foreclosed all covert activities they discovered. They also denied sanctuary to Jews fleeing the Nazis. They profited enormously from pocketing funds deposited in Swiss banks by both prominent Nazis and their Jewish victims, which later went unclaimed because their owners had perished. The daughter of a rich French Holocaust victim, Estelle Sapir, later said, "My father was able to protect his money from the Nazis, but not from the Swiss." Switzerland provided an important technological and industrial support to the Axis war effort in 1941, increasing its exports to Germany of chemicals by 250%, metals by 500%. The country became a major receiver of stolen goods from the Nazi pillage of Europe and banked what the OSS, Washington's Covert Operations Organization, categorized as gigantic sums of fugitive funds. The Swiss unblinkingly paid to the Nazis the proceeds of life insurance policies held by German Jews, and the Bern government dismissed the post-war recriminations about such action as irrelevant under Swiss law. Only a fraction of Switzerland's enormous profits from wartime misappropriations were ever acknowledged, and even a smaller portion paid out to Jewish victims and their families. The war proved good business for the ice-hearted cantons. Among the belligerents, unsurprisingly, the more distant was a given Allied country from the consequences of Axis aggression, the less ill will its people displayed towards the enemy. For instance, an Office of War Information poll in mid-1942 found that 1/3 of Americans expressed willingness to make a separate peace with Germany. A January 1944 opinion poll survey showed that while 45% of British professed to hate the Germans, only 27% of Canadians did so. I mean, part of the reason for this idea of a separate peace is that it was a device that had been employed by Wilson during the First World War. Wilson obviously joined America into the Allied camp as an associate power, not as a full ally, because he looked at the French and the British and said, well, you know, you're not really wildly different from the Germans. You're imperialists. Your empires have caused this war. A kind of a curse on all of you, really. But the enemy in Germany is just more destructive to civilization than either of you. And it was a way of also not becoming associated with any of the kind of secret and nefarious plots that the British and the French had made between themselves during the war years before America had joined in the carving up of the Middle East, amongst other matters. So there was a history of, separate peace. There was a kind of quite a deep skepticism of Britain, an antipathy towards Britain, and a not unfounded suspicion in America that Winston Churchill would fight for his empire using American soldiers to do it. The Southeast Asia Command, SEAC, was referred to by embittered American soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors as Save England's Asian Colonies. And right they were to be wary, because this was Britain's chief war aim: preserve its empire. And America has its own war aims too. America has, a clear, Roosevelt from 1941 onwards, with the Arcadia Conference and his meeting with Churchill in Placentia Bay, clearly set out an intention to preserve to advance American interests, and to dismantle tariff barriers around the British Empire. This is a key war aim, because that has huge, huge benefits for American trade. For most people in Europe and Asia, the conflict was a pervasive reality. Families in of the Asian republics of the Soviet Union, amongst the remotest place on earth, found their menfolk conscripted for the Red Army, prison camps established within sight of their villages, and food chronically short. A Japanese air raid on the North Australian port of Darwin on the 19th of February 1942 killed 297 people, most of them service personnel on ships in the harbour. Though the attack was never repeated on anything like such a scale, Australia was thereafter troubled only by sporadic small-scale Japanese naval intrusions. The country's sense of invulnerability was shattered. Tribesmen on the Pacific Islands and in the Asian jungles were enlisted to serve one army or another, though often oblivious of what their sponsors were fighting about. Even in parts of Russia, the same ignorance obtained. Beside the Pechora River, inside the Arctic Circle, a Gulag camp boss described how villagers had a very vague understanding about what was going on in the world. They did not even know much about the Soviet war with Germany. It's interesting, the example of Australia there. In military historians now kind of have come to a broad consensus that Japan didn't intend to invade Australia. It's really way too big for them to, try to conquer all of Southeast Asia, China, and fight a war in the Pacific, and also seize Australia. What they wanted to do was to strangle Australia, to strangle it, to cut off routes in by sea, so that America couldn't use it as a huge marshalling yard for a campaign northwards through the Pacific Islands, which is obviously kind of what happens. So the battles for the Pacific Islands, the South Pacific Islands, which are some of the bloodiest of the war, were about keeping those sea lanes open. You put an airfield on one of those islands, and you can sink all manner of ships making their way to Australia from America. Large minorities in the belligerent nations, with notable exception of Italy, supported the causes championed by their respective governments, at least until they started losing. But minorities dissented, and thousands were imprisoned in consequence, some of them by the democracies. So too were people whose allegiance was deemed suspect, sometimes grossly unjustly. Britain in 1939 detained all its German residents, including Jewish fugitives from Hitler.
The new McCrispy Strip is here. Dip approved by ketchup, tangy barbecue, honey mustard, Sprite, McFlurry, Big Mac sauce, double dipped in buffalo and ranch, more ranch, and creamy chili McCrispy Strip Dip. Now at McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows homes so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews all on the app. Download today.
The historian G.M. Trevelyan was among prominent figures who denounced indiscriminate internment, saying that the government failed to recognise the great harm that is being done to our cause, essentially a moral cause, and by the continued imprisonment of political refugees. America made the same mistake in the hysteria following Pearl Harbor by interning its Nisei Japanese. The governor of Idaho, supporting drastic measures, said, "The Japs live like rats, breed like rats, and act like rats. We don't want them." At the outbreak of the war, the United States was by no means a homogeneous society. American Jews, for instance, suffered suspicion, if not hostility, from their own countrymen, exemplified by their exclusion from country clubs and other elite institutions. A wartime survey showed that Jews were mistrusted more than any other identified ethnic group except Italians. A poll in December 1944 showed that while most Americans accepted that Hitler had killed some Jews, they disbelieved reports that he was slaughtering them in millions. And again, I mean, I've talked a lot about this, about the Holocaust and historical memory and, what people knew and what people thought was true. And in most Allied countries, the idea that there was a Holocaust, comes much later, a generation later in many cases. And the idea that the people that we were seeing that one saw on kind of Pathé newsreels, these kind of piles of dead piled up in camps, or kind of emaciated, kind of skeletal people, that these weren't just political prisoners or prisoners of war. These were racial victims of Nazism. These were Jewish victims. That wasn't really abundantly clear to lots of people for a long time. And certainly it wasn't abundantly clear at the end of the Second World War. And the BBC, in the famous news reportage about the opening of Belsen Camp, where Richard Dimbleby, the great broadcaster of the day, went in with the army, the word Jewish really isn't mentioned at all. It is they're described as prisoners. So the next one of these I'm going to finish now. But the next one of these we're going to look at the status of Black Americans, particularly Black GIs, coming to Britain during this kind of struggle for freedom and the realities of that struggle for them. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'll catch you on the next podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.
Did you know that foreign investors are quietly funding lawsuits in American courts through a practice called third-party litigation funding? Shadowy overseas funders are paying to sue American companies in our courts, and they don't pay a dime in U.S. taxes if there is an award or settlement. They profit tax-free from our legal system, while U.S. companies are tied up in court, and American families pay the price, to the tune of $5,000 a year. But there is a solution. A new proposal before Congress would close this loophole and ensure these foreign investors pay taxes, just like the actual plaintiffs have to. It's a common sense move that discourages frivolous and abusive lawsuits and redirects resources back into American jobs, innovation, and growth. Only President Trump and congressional Republicans can deliver this win for America and hold these foreign investors accountable. Contact your lawmakers today and demand they take a stand to end foreign-funded litigation abuse.
Welcome to It Takes Energy, presented by Energy Transfer, where we talk all things oil and natural gas. Oil and gas drive our economy, ensure our country's security, and open pathways to brighter futures. What do you know about oil and natural gas? You likely associate them with running your car or heating your home. But these two natural resources fuel so much more than that. More than 6,000 consumer products that we rely on every day are made using oil and gas. Before you even step out the door in the morning, you've already used more products made possible because of oil and gas than you realize. From the toothpaste you brush your teeth with, the soap you washed your face with, and the sheets you slept on. Not to mention your makeup, contact lenses, clothes, and shoes. Oil and gas are vital parts of all these products and so many more. Look around and you'll see the essential role oil and gas plays in our lives. Our world needs oil and gas, and people rely on us to deliver it. To learn more, visit energytransfer.com.